situations, both in legal and medical fields. We are having changes led by us in the traditional Hippocratic oath and also the medical ethics, which are medical professions use for many years. We are also seeing many legal fields facing these problems and also understanding changes. Through this webinar, we can understand how we are going to keep up with these changes given by this pandemic. And coming to the speakers, for today's, we are having Dr. Samira Gunawardena and Dr. Ravindra Samaranayaka, senior lecturers from the Department of Forensic Medicine and Toxicology. Before we start, if you're having any questions during the presentation, just drop them in the chat box below. All the questions will be answered during the Q&A sessions towards the end of the webinar. Let me introduce our speakers briefly. Both Dr. Samira Gunawardena and Ravindra Senanayaka, specialists and senior lecturers in Department of Forensic Medicine and Toxicology. Dr. Samira Gunawardena is currently being in the position as the head of the department. Both doctors have over 15 years of experience in the field of forensic medicine, which is a specialty that addresses many legal and ethical aspects in the clinic practices. Department of Forensic Medicine and Toxicology is actively involved in the provisions of medical legal service and public, including the forensic investigations of deaths and all the coming across difficult situations that provides because of this pandemic situation. And also they have experienced the issues and challenges and changes the families of the patients and the healthcare department and the enforcement change, especially in relations in the management of COVID provisions deaths. Without any further delays, we welcome Dr. Samira Gunawardena and Dr. Ravindra Senanayaka to start this valuable webinar. Doctor?
Thank you, Kirtisha. Just a little correction. I think it's Ravindra Samaranayaka. Ravi, are you there?
Yes, Samir, I am here. You want me to switch on the video?
So just to say hi to everyone who has joined. So thank you very much, Kirtisha, Kefra, and all the others at the Law Students Association for inviting us. So as Kirtisha mentioned, both Ravi and I are senior lecturers at the Department of Forensic Medicine. And first of all, I'm sorry, I couldn't check if all can hear me clearly.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, good. And also, if you don't mind, Kirtisha, if you could make me a co-host, I can then share the screen for the presentation as well. So, well, we have been invited to give this talk on mainly ethical issues in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And both Ravi and I were kind of wondering as to how we set about it. The main challenge that we have is, you see, talking about ethical issues through a webinar or even a lecture is a bit of a challenge because it's not an exact science. So there is no clear set guideline, like, for example, as to how you would treat a patient with heart attack or so on. When it comes to these ethical issues, there is always going to be an element of subjectivity, some amount of maybe philosophy that needs to come in. So it's not easy giving a straightforward talk on ethical issues. And even more challenging is the fact that we are trying to talk about this pandemic situation, COVID-19, which is a completely new scenario that has befallen the world entire world, and pretty much the whole world is going through this major turmoil at the moment. And so we are only one country. Sri Lanka is only one country that is facing these issues. And so all we can do is really just talk about the best practices and the best approaches that we can do within our country. So, Ravi, if you could just, while I share the screen, maybe you would like to give a little introduction also, if you like. I'll just turn on the screen.
I just wanted to thank Samira Kirtisha for inviting us. And as Samira told, the ethical issue, discussing ethical issue in any sort of educational activities, it's very difficult. As Samira told, there is no right and wrong thing. It's depending on your point of view. You can argue for in both ways. So and sometimes you may call it's a boring in a single world. But everybody will realize Samir is a good lecturer, and we'll try to make it palatable to you all, and we'll discuss discussing the ethical issues in this pandemic situation. Samir?
Yes, thanks. Yes, that's right. So we'll try to make this boring topic as let's say enjoyable as possible, although it's not really an enjoyable issue that we're talking about. But can everyone see my screen?
Yes, so we can see that.
Okay, great. So so as I said, so mainly the points that we are going to discuss, even though we've said that we are within the medico-legal framework, primarily here what we would be addressing is mainly the ethical issues. And how I thought that we would structure our discussion is, so rather than doing the conventional format of me speaking and then the other speaker speaking, rather we thought we would combine and give a sort of a combined presentation where I would I would talk a little bit about some of these ethical aspects in healthcare. So just that, because I believe that most of the participants here are within a non-medical sort of background. So I thought it would be good to kind of first introduce some of the concepts so that you won't be totally, you won't feel out of place when we actually talk about some of these terms, like, say, for example, autonomy and so on. So I'll first give a little introduction about it. And then I will sort of set the stage as to, you see, the history of how pandemics and epidemics have occurred within the world. So we most of us actually are new to this pandemic situation because we haven't really faced it. But in fact, the world has. So there have been several pandemics over the years in the world, and how the healthcare has responded to these pandemics would it be interesting to kind of know how or what lessons history teaches. And then, of course, we will go to the main crunch of the lecture, where we will be talking about the ethical dilemmas that we are facing in the management of this epidemic or pandemic situation, right? So let me just give a brief introduction into what we refer to as ethics in healthcare. Now, Kirtisha started off, I think, by introducing the fact that so we are, as doctors, following a Hippocratic oath. I think this is what generally the impression is, that doctors follow this Hippocratic oath and so on. But what people don't realize is the Hippocratic oath is only actually just one aspect of ethics, or even the codes that we are generally covered by. Now, with the evolution of medicine right throughout history, there have been several codes or several, let's say, guidelines or even frameworks within which clinical practice has happened, right? So they date back way back to the 3000 BC, where we talk about the Veda Grantha, the Siddhar Vedas. So these are famous, let's say, ancient codes that have been in practice way before the advent of Western medicine to the world. And then subsequently, we talk about this code of Hammurabi, which is pretty much the code that was used by mostly the Persian medical practitioners at the time. So the Hippocratic Oath is fairly new in relation to some of these things. So it's not exactly clear when the Hippocratic Oath originated. It's known that it is not actually Hippocrates himself who actually originated the code. It's something that was developed later on, and it was termed as a mark of respect to him. But it's somewhere around 300 BC time. But now, for modern day practice, there are several other codes, and probably one of the most famous is the Australian Medical Association, the AMA code, which developed somewhere in the mid 1800s. And then since then, there have been several other declarations and documents that have been put out, which govern clinical practice. So if you go through this list, you'll see that there are pretty much many declarations or documents or guidelines that can be incorporated in different circumstances. So as you can see, so abortions, torture, human experimentation, what are the ethics in terminal illnesses? Terminal illnesses meaning when people get something like, say, severe cancers that are untreatable, and we know that the patient is now going to die in a few weeks or months. So what are the ethics that are involved in treating such patients? So you can see that there are different declarations and codes that are governing this kind of practice. Now, of course, it's funny that although we've had several pandemics and such, there isn't really a guideline or a code that covers these pandemic or epidemic situations. The closest that we can find is really the American Medical Association code, where there are two sections which are sort of related to this pandemic scenario. In fact, it's not necessarily pandemic, but it covers mainly any kind of disaster situation. So it's more like in terms of if there's a natural disaster or any kind of disaster, what would be the physician's responsibilities? So two things that I would like to sort of highlight in that code. So as you can see, there is one which says, okay, in a disaster situation, especially let's say in a pandemic or epidemic situation, the doctor has an obligation to provide medical care even in the face of greater than usual risk to his or her own safety. So that's a very interesting concept. So now this is probably one of the let's say the most used codes, which tell a doctor that, look, in a pandemic situation, you need to actually contribute a little bit more than what you normally do, right? So this is the code of the American Medical Association. However, even within that, there is then another caveat which says that even though you have to contribute, you also have to ensure that you are safe, right? Because if you don't ensure your own safety, then you might not be in a position to provide that care in the future, which could be more disastrous. So there is this balance that we have to always maintain. And the second part in that code refers to a topic that we might talk, or that we will talk about that issue a little bit later, which is the allocation of resources, especially in a scenario of a disaster where the amount of resources can be limited, right? So these are two little areas that are covered by this American Medical Association code. Now, of course, codes alone generally are insufficient to actually address many of these ethical issues that arise when we are treating patients. So there are several complex decisions that sometimes need to be taken in respect of patients in various situations. And so you can't have a code that would, let's say, cover all of those situations. So therefore, there were several developments in terms of how ethics was introduced into medical education and medical practice. And one of the most, let's say, well established principles were developed in the mid 1980s by Beauchamp and Childress. And this is the concept which you might have heard about, which are called the four cornerstones of ethics. Four cornerstones of medical ethics, namely autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Now, I'll just take a minute to tell you basically what these terms mean. So, autonomy essentially refers to the patient being in control of what is done to that particular, what is done to him or her. In other words, a doctor has to make sure that the patient agrees to whatever treatment is given to him, right? That him or her. That is the basic principle of autonomy, and that is why before we do any kind of surgery or any kind of intervention, we take consent. That process of consent comes from the basic principle of autonomy. Then we have beneficence, which simply means that a doctor must at all times, or when I say doctor, I don't mean doctor here. These principles, they cut across all the healthcare workers, right? So even though I say doctor because I'm a doctor, but otherwise just understand that this is applicable to all healthcare workers. That the healthcare worker has to ensure that whatever the healthcare worker is doing for the patient is in the best interest of the patient, right? It's the best interest of the patient. And conversely, the nothing should be done that would result in a harm to the patient. Now, of course, already you might have some idea that, especially in this COVID situation, some of these principles are already getting, let's say, tested, right? I mean, so for example, as we will talk about, let's say if we have to report someone being positive to the authorities, and that person has to now be taken to a hospital or to a quarantine center, then, and if the person does not want to go, but still the person has to go, so then where is the autonomy? So what is the principle that we apply here? So these are kind of the let's say dilemmas that sometimes arise. Justice, on the other hand, is a very simple principle which says that everyone has to be treated fairly, everyone has to be treated equally, despite the socioeconomic status, despite the ethnicity, despite the citizenship, everybody has to be treated equally. So those are the main four cornerstones of ethics, right? Okay, so if I now move on to the next part, which is to kind of give an overview of several, well, not several, a few pandemics, major pandemics that have hit this world. I suppose the first one that we would have to talk about is this Black Death, which is the bubonic plague that happened somewhere in the mid 14th century. One of the largest death tolls that happened from a pandemic situation. Almost about 200 million deaths, and nearly wiped out half of Europe. So again, said to have originated in China. And then you know that during those times the Silk Route was a very famous trade route within the world, and so that is how people say that it entered Europe. And the infective agent was a bacteria which was transmitted through these little fleas that mainly came from rats. And again, these rats were said to have been carrying these fleas, and they were in these ships that brought in various vessels and so on. So now this is one of the most earliest pandemics, global pandemics, that we generally sort of learn about or read about. And you can see that you see even right from those days, the response to pandemics had been sort of very in a way brutal, right? So now these images of these people on the right here are actually doctors, well, physicians. So you can see that this is how they responded at the time to protect themselves. So they had these little like masks which had little beaks, and these were made of leather. And there are some reports that say that they are sometimes lined with certain types of essence or herbs and things like that to prevent the spread. So you can see how the health or the physicians respond to these kind of epidemic situations. And I was very interested to come across a little let's say a quote from a kind of a chronicle that was written, which sort of describes the social aspect of this pandemic situation. And if you read that, you realize that again it's the same, right? Even now it's pretty much the same. So from the bubonic plague, I think the next one that most people talk about is the Spanish flu, which, as you know, was the 1918 Spanish flu, which, of course, didn't actually originate in Spain, unfortunately, but the name stuck. And this is an influenza virus. It's 1N1 strain, which again spread right across the globe. And here it was the reason for the spread was very, very different. It was actually the World War, the First World War, which is regarded as the main reason for the rapid spread of these virus right across the globe, because the troops that were stationed in Europe, when they went back to their respective countries, they just took it with them, right? So these are two main pandemics that hit the world way back. And then since then, of course, there have been several outbreaks regularly that were affecting the world, but not reaching the pandemic situation. They were more sort of regional epidemics. And until this coronavirus, 2019 novel coronavirus was introduced or came to the world, pretty much there were no major pandemics that occurred. Right. So with that, let me just move on now. I thought that we would talk about these ethical issues mainly as sort of different aspects. And I'll talk about, or we will both talk about these individual areas separately and sometimes together. So these are the main things that we are going to touch on. That is the rights of the individual versus the rights to society. What about the allocation of resources, including this concept of triaging patients. So triaging means that we have to sometimes pick and choose which patients get the first preference, so on, right? So for treatment or for vaccination or whatever, that's called triaging. Then, of course, something about the use of media. And as you see, so the media is an important part in the management of pandemic, but sometimes there can be negative aspects of that, and we'll talk about that. Something about the law enforcement, and here we will talk about how effective, or let's say the use of legal measures like the quarantine ordinance, and also the use of the military in controlling and also maintaining the law and order in relation to pandemic situations. And finally, I will briefly talk about the issue in relation to disposal of dead, mainly about the scenario about how we need to balance that dignity of dying with the safety issues that come about in pandemic situations. So I think I'll just take a brief rest there. I would like it. I think probably if there are any questions or anything that you would like to sort of ask, we could just take a little break before I go on to the main part about the first two things. Any things that you'd like to touch on, Kirtisha, or should I just continue?
It's fine, sir. You can continue.
Right. Okay. So I think we will move on to the main part of the ethical dilemmas. Now, when it comes to the this discussion about rights of the individual versus rights of the society, I think that's how we termed it. And I think Ravi will take over from the next slide a little bit more. But I'd like to just briefly tell you a little bit about the medical aspect of COVID-19. Now, uh, we have been continuously told that COVID-19 is a lethal disease, right? However, the lethality is a little bit circumspect here, because unlike the diseases like, say, dengue or Ebola, or the other Japanese encephalitis, we don't see the virus being able to kill off a healthy person. So we don't really see that. Essentially, what we see is that this virus infects a person who is either elderly with multiple other diseases or illnesses, right, or someone who has some kind of weak immunity, and creates a problem in them. So here there is a little bit of a confusion as to whether we can call COVID-19 a lethal disease. Now, if I just skip back to the previous slide, which showed you some of the other epidemics. Now, you'll note that, say, for example, the bird flu that happened in 2003, the swine flu that happened in 2000, sorry, the MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory virus that happened in 2012. So you can see, look at the fatality rates here, right? So this is about 50%. Ebola is somewhere around 40%. But look at COVID, it's really about 5.3. So some countries it has reached about 10 to 15 level, but it's not as high as these. But of course, the question, the issue here is that COVID has a very high transmission rate. But the key thing is 80% of those people who actually develop the illness, that is, those who become COVID positive, right, don't show any symptoms, don't show any signs. In other words, these people are technically healthy people. Theoretically, they are healthy people. But unfortunately, because of the fact that they have the virus, they can now transmit the virus, right? So this this brings out the very first dilemma that we have, because now we have this concept of mandatory admitting people who are found to be COVID positive in hospitals, even though they have no illness, right? So this is one of the, now why do we do this? Because we are scared that they will transmit the illness and therefore they can infect someone who is actually vulnerable. So to protect that vulnerable person, now we have to admit this person to a hospital. So this is the first part that we talk about. Ravi, I think I'll just stop there, and then why don't you take over and just discuss this?
Yes, Samira. Now, any hospital admission, let's say a planned hospital admission, even can make your daily routine upside down, let alone a mandatory emergency hospital admission. Now, if that person is the breadwinner or the main key person in that family, that can make that situation, I mean, it can worsen that situation. Just imagine you are a normal person, you are told that you are a 3-letter PCR positive and you don't have any symptoms, and you are compelled to go to a hospital about 100 and 200 kilometers away from your family. Now, that situation, sometimes when you are analyzing the situation outside that shoes of that person, you can argue that it's a normal thing now. It's only 14 days. Why can't you go and come back? But consider, think a little bit about the situation. Now, who will look after that person's children? And sometimes you have children with special needs, and you only know the medical drugs and how to feed these children, and that applies to the elderly parents also, who will look after those parents while you are away from the house? And now, sometimes you may think these are trivial things, like, feeding the pets. Some pets are very, they are very specific. They will only eat when the specific person give them the food. Otherwise they don't eat. So, and even the watering the plants, like it may not be the valuable crops, but even the flowers, some people, they consider that's very, very unique thing. So you are suddenly you are told to, go to hospital 150 kilometers away, without considering all these things. um, uh, Now that can create a very disturbing situation to everybody. Then ultimately it will lead to some other societal issues, like they can hide the fact that you are having this disease, because you are forced to go to hospital. How ethical is it? And all these things are done because you are told that the societal benefits are superseded your autonomy. And Samira told that the medical ethics, probably the major thing is the patient's autonomy or your autonomy. If you have the capacity, or you can consent to anything which is not a criminal offense. But here you are told uh, your autonomy is now in the we can put your to the second part, but we have to take care of the society. We do this because we need to protect the society, but you have to you have to somewhat somehow manage these situations, because we need to protect the society. That is a major ethical dilemma in this COVID situation.
Thanks,
Samira?
Ravi. Yeah, thanks, Ravi. Yes, so that's, I think, one of the first issues that we talked about. Now here itself you can see, so the as Ravi said, so completely putting patient autonomy below the benefit to the society, right? So that is one dilemma that we now face. Then, of course, someone can also start questioning this very aspect of societal beneficence. Is there actually a benefit? Now, you would have seen this little graph shown several times, that all of these measures, these restrictions, social restrictions, lockdowns, curfews, travel restrictions, all of those things are done to flatten this curve. I'm sure you would have heard this term. So, what they mean by flattening this curve is that if we do not flatten this curve, there will be so many cases of emergency patients, or ill patients, which the healthcare services of the country cannot support. And this is what we did see in UK, Italy, USA, almost all these countries which have a much better healthcare support system than ours, but still they also struggled, and even they're still struggling. So this flattening of the curve is done through major restrictions in our lifestyle. So there is curfews imposed, travel bans, we still can't go overseas. Now, what are the secondary effects of all of this, or what are the long-term effects of all of these, right? Now, let's talk about education. So one whole year has completely gone by. For example, in our university, where sometimes one entire batch was not able to join the university. And this is, I'm just talking about our faculty alone, right? So, but we can talk about all the other faculties, we talk about school. The impact of those things are yet to come. So we may have reduced the high burden on the healthcare system, but have we, because through that, have we created a bigger burden to the education system, right? So this is a nice photograph, or actually a picture that was in an article by Kitmina Hevage. I think there was a nice blog post there. So, I mean, you can just imagine the economic impact of all of these restrictions on Sri Lanka. Now, countries like Australia or Canada, USA, they have very high reserves, so they can afford to sometimes go into lockdowns for periodic for short intervals or periods, and they still have a way of sustaining themselves. In fact, Australia, when people or patients, or so when positive people were told to go to hospitals or quarantine centers, there was a mechanism where they were given a kind of a compensation for their income. So these sort of things, those countries can afford to do, but Sri Lanka, it's not possible. So then we have to now start to balance it out. Do we go for a lockdown, or do we let the economy run? Because if we shut down the economy by thinking about the patients, we may lose a bigger we may have a bigger problem on our hands. There are other several social benefits, like, for example, there have been sort of issues or questions raised on various other aspects, like domestic violence, cases of abuse being high, even the whole issue of lockdown and this fear that came about among people to actually go out, to go to hospitals because of the fear of contracting the illness. Indirectly, it has also caused a disruption of normal healthcare services for other illnesses. Now, this is a WHO survey that was done somewhere in August, and as you can see, so quite a lot of normal service functions have been disrupted in several countries, right? So, reproductive, maternal, newborn child. So, I mean, that's a large amount to be disrupted, because that's a very major part in a person's life, right? Pregnancy and childbirth. So other diseases like heart disease, strokes, cancers, you can see how much of disruption there's been. And this is true. Even in Sri Lanka, there's been several disruptions because clinics were unable to function. Emergency services in our country did not drop significantly, but you can see some studies from USA and all, where sometimes the drop in emergency admissions has been something like 40%. So 40% of people who usually would come to hospitals now did not come to hospitals. And these are emergency situations. So imagine that a person is having a chest pain and he's worried that it might be a heart attack, but he's afraid to go to the hospital because of COVID. And in fact, this is something that we tended to see because, as you know, as forensic specialists, we are involved in forensic investigations of deaths, inquests, and so on. And we have seen this happening. We have seen several cases where people have stayed at home despite having chest pain. So when you ask the relatives, they say, yes, he had a chest pain, but he didn't want to go to hospital because he was scared. And then when we did the autopsy, we find that it was a heart attack. So if that person had gone to hospital with that chest pain, that death could have been easily preventable. So this is a little image from our departmental cases. This graph, it just shows you. So this is in red is the average number of deaths that were investigated in our department over the last 8 years. The line in green is 2019, and look at the line in blue, 2020. So November, December, when the major lockdown happened, look at the number of deaths that just spiked. And these are not COVID deaths. I'm talking about other deaths. Right? These are heart diseases and various other illnesses people dying from. So most of these would have otherwise normally been taken care of in a hospital setting. Okay, so this is now we did all of this to prevent mortality from COVID-19, but indirectly it appears that we may have created a greater mortality through other diseases. So this comes to another aspect as to whether we are actually providing sufficient healthcare for other medical conditions. And again, Ravi, I would like to invite you to.
Yes, Samira. Now, uh, 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 since you are most of you all are non-medical personnel, in medicine there is concept called for some emergencies there is concept called golden hour. For example, in heart attack, strokes, some obstetric emergencies like ectopic pregnancies, if you uh, admit to a hospital with relatively good facilities, within that hour or within soon after the symptoms occur, if there is a medical intervention, there is 100% cure of that condition. Basically you are cured. Um, uh, and that's why it is termed as golden hour. But with this pandemic, even if you go to a hospital, uh, now the health staff is feared because you are getting COVID, and you are trying to screen the person with a heart attack or ectopic pregnancy for COVID, and you are then by the time that the PCR report or the antigen report available, your golden hour is gone. And then again, that somebody can argue that it can if the health staff get the COVID, they can transmit it to the other people, and there will be another cluster there. As Samir told, the American code, you have to treat the patient getting the risk, but at the same time you have to calculate that risk and attend the patient, because if you get it, you may not be in a healthy state to treat another person. So and on top of that, now when you suspect this COVID-19, it's not the people are quarantined not in no individual basis. It's most of the time 14, 16, 20, the entire health staff, because in an emergency there will be a lot of members attending that patient. Now then, if that patient is suspected to have COVID, all of them are quarantined. Then there will be a less staff members to attend the other person. Other thing is now because of this fear, everybody is wearing this personal protective equipments. Even to measure a temperature of a patient, you have to wear this. And just imagine the financial burden, because these these advanced personal protective wear is very costly. Other thing is the ambulance facilities. When the ambulance is used for one person to transmit suspected COVID patient, you have to fumigate that ambulance. You have to clean it, and and it is not available to take another person quickly. The other thing is, as previously told, for any medical emergency, the medical staff is told to screen the patient for COVID, and then only you attend into the emergency situation. Samira?
Thank you, Ravi. So, from that, if we move on to another ethical dilemma, uh, again, that is very much seen in COVID situations, it is the allocation of healthcare resources. Now, we'll talk about both the allocation of healthcare resources and also this concept of triaging together. Now, I just use, now, of course, when you say allocation of healthcare resources, it means both, it means personnel, it means equipment, it means facilities, all of them. Now, the brunt of work that is done by or done in this pandemic situation falls on the public healthcare workers or the community healthcare workers, and especially the public health inspectors and the medical officers of health, MOH areas. So you can see that, I mean, now we used to know them a lot from mainly from our dengue epidemics, because they used to be sort of screening our gardens and so on and households to see if we have areas which can breed dengue. And of course, even those days, they would sometimes have these little systems of imposing fines. So now they have mainly been diverted to the COVID screening and contact tracing situation. So you might have heard, like several, I think few months back, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, because you see, now this is a very difficult situation. There is a limited amount of public health inspectors who have to deal with entire communities, sometimes major communities in large numbers. They have to sort of find the contacts, they have to sort of get them to stay quarantined, isolated, and most people don't want to. And then there are, of course, conflicts that are happening between the communities and the PHIs. So these are major problems that are faced by the healthcare workers. And on top of that, sometimes the healthcare workers, the employer, that is the Ministry of Health, is also limited in the amount of support that they can give to such healthcare workers. So they demand a lot, but they are unable to provide everything. For example, sometimes even the provision of protective wear, the provision of, let's say, transport. These are major issues for people like public health inspectors in the management of this disease. Now, when it comes to the allocation of facilities or resources to patients, so the choice of who gets what, who gets the first priority, is a very sort of, it's probably the biggest ethical dilemma that many countries are facing. Fortunately, Sri Lanka has not come into that state yet, because we don't still see large numbers of patients, ill patients, coming into our hospitals. But you know, and you've seen from the news how UK, USA are really suffering with the large number of people. Now, with the new strain that has come into UK, you can see that there is a high attendance of people coming needing ICU and ventilation. But so the number of ventilator beds are less, the number of staff that are there are less, because of well, basically sometimes the staff are also infected with the disease. And you would have heard that several staff members in UK also actually died from the disease. So now this becomes a very crucial issue as to how you decide it. So there are again different guidelines that have been put out. It used to be, so there used to be a kind of difference in how we choose it. So earlier it was basically if you can save the more number of people, then that is the number of lives, then you go for that. But now gradually it has changed, and now things have the principles have changed into, you don't think about the number of lives, but you think about the years of life that can be gained. So automatically this now puts people who are in the elderly population at a disadvantage, because so if you are elderly, then the number of lives that you are expected to live, the number of years that you are expected to live could be much less. So this is a major ethical issue, especially in terms of determining COVID-19 treatment. And I thought, I'll just put a little question to you all. Say, for example, if you were now in a position where you had to choose as a hospital director, where you had to provide only one ICU bed to two patients who come at the same time. So there is no first come first serve basis here. So both of them are there at the same time. And so one patient A, is a 75-year-old person who has multiple diseases, heart disease, stroke, cancer. He has been a very good friend of the hospital, given several donations. On the other hand, you have another person, a 45-year-old carpenter, has 4 children, has a history of alcohol, liver disease, diabetes, and also has a history of domestic violence. So not a very socially, let's say, recognized person. So now, if you had the choice, who would you choose? Kyokusha, is it okay to just ask that question, and maybe people could actually send in their responses? That I think that would be nice.
Yes, sir, you can do it. Yes.
So maybe you could just send it through the chat. Just say A or B. There aren't many, so we can. Who would you choose? Okay, so we have one Tirini who says B, Sangeet B. So if you don't mind, Jarashi says also B, as he can live more number of years that the patient A. Yeah. So the that is the basic principle that we generally use in terms of the number of years that the person may live. Now, unfortunately, there is an ethical dilemma here. Now, just because a person can live another 15, 10, 20 years, you would wonder whether those 15, 20 years would be productive years. As in, if this is a person who is regularly beating his wife and drinking. So, whereas if the businessman lives another 5 years, even there could be a lot more, let's say, valuable contributions that could happen to the society. So these are some things that sometimes it's very difficult to just go by a very blanket, arbitrary policy saying, okay, let's go with so and so because he has more years to live, right? So these are some of the ethical dilemmas that are faced even in this COVID situation. Uh, I came across a very nice little statement from this professor, a senior professor, emeritus professor in ethics from the University of Vanderbilt. So he actually just writes about his own feelings if he ever gets COVID, and it's very sort of it's very kind of stimulating to think that okay, if there are people out there who also feel that if they do get COVID because they are old, they would actually give their let's say place to someone else, someone younger, to be saved, right? But I doubt very much that this is the sentiment that most or many other elderly people would have, right? So we come to maybe the last few things in terms of say the use of media and the use of the military. I think again, Ravi, would you like to talk about the media aspect?
Yes, Amir. In any given society, media play a very important role. Now, probably that's why they are called, the fourth state. Sri Lanka too is not different than that. Okay, now my question time. Uh, can somebody tell me now if you are okay? We'll first give credits to media. Can somebody tell me what are the good things done by media in this pandemic situation? I hope they did at least one good thing. Anybody?
Doctor?
What in your view? Go ahead.
Yes, doctor. And the media is telling us when the a lockdown is over and when the lockdown is going to happen?
Okay, okay. So media basically, okay, there is a chat. They told the general public about the safety precautions, and yeah, the safety. Basically, the media educate the general public basically 24/7. Things that you should do, things that you should not do, and about the the lockdown situation and the travel restrictions. So in that aspect, media did a uh, good good role. Okay, now we have to take. Now, if you ask to take a credit back, what are the things that you, in your opinion, things that media did bad in this situation? Anyone?
Hello.
Okay, go ahead.
Some media playing and giving and hate speeches regarding some kind of uh, group of society. They are spreading like this. They are acting like this for a COVID spread for
Yeah.
COVID.
Yes. Yeah, Sangeet says that sometimes they tell lies and they telecasted how people were taking. Yes, that actually they live feed people being taken to hospital. It's like a national event. Some X is taken to Kandakadu. They take the camera. It's live in national television in prime time. They showed it to the entire country, which is very private, very very basic, uh, which is not newsworthy thing, but they even live telecast. So um, by doing those things, media create sort of a stigma around this COVID, thereby people ultimately people, as I told earlier, people were afraid of telling the authorities that they have these symptoms. And sometimes you can remember, I mean, you can remember that sometimes the media, the news in news telecast, they told that so X is diagnosed to have PCR positive, and X went to a wedding, or X went to church, or X went to the temple. Now, going to a temple and going to a wedding is not a crime. Most of the time, these people did these activities not knowing that they are PCR positive, but the media highlighted that thing as if they are committing a crime. So and then this the other issue of Samira, the next slide, please. Uh, uh, Now, the other issue of this privilege communication. Now, as the law, as lawyers or lawyers to be, you all are fortunate enough, according to the Sri Lankan Evidence Ordinance, Section 126, your communication between your client has absolute privilege, and you are you cannot be compelled even by the courts to reveal certain informations uh, uh, that you got to know from your client. But unfortunately for the medical community, this privilege is not given. It's only a consider a ethic. if we breach this this privilege, it's not a criminal offense. It's probably you can sue the doctor from the ethical issues, and can report to the Sri Lanka Medical Council. But as for lawyers, you have uh, uh, statutory law that you have privileged communication, and your client relationship between you and your client is sealed. But since medical fraternity does not have that privilege, again that the the autonomy, the patient's autonomy is superseded by the societal benefit. Somebody can argue the fact that you have the COVID, we have to tell it to the authorities, because the society at large is at risk, at a greater risk. Sir, there is a doubt about information which come from the rural areas. There are deaths, patients, but actually those deaths are patients calculate. We'll discuss these now. Nuanti will discuss this when when we discuss the burial and the statistics. We'll discuss. Um, um, Now, as I told you earlier, the media role in this COVID pandemic, we can discuss in both ways, positive and negative. Samira.
Thank you, Ravi. Yes, I think we'll discuss some of the questions in relation to the deaths a bit later on. So, along with the issue of using media, or the positives and the negatives of using media in the management of the pandemic, similarly, we also have the law enforcement and the military that has possibly both helped the management, as well as on the other hand, created certain negative aspects in the management. Now, of course, the positive part, now we know normally, I mean, even during all of these previous pandemics, we had situations where sometimes regulations were not followed, right? So uh, people will always be people. So you will have people who follow regulations, people who don't follow regulations. And there are various reasons as to why people don't follow regulations, which are a bit complex and maybe not the best time to talk about it, but for whatever reason, that can happen. So sometimes you do need a kind of a firm hand to ensure that certain guidelines are put in place, certain regulations are put in place, and that these are followed. Now, in relation to the COVID pandemic, what the country did was immediately uh, reinstate the quarantine ordinance. That was, I think, mainly established way back in the I think mid 1800s, mid 1860s or time, mainly to sort of to minimize the impact of diseases like cholera. Actually, even the H1, even the Spanish flu also was sort of affected by this quarantine ordinance. Um, so these were reinitiated through special gazette notifications, and along with that, certain principles like, say, social distancing, the wearing of masks in public places, they were made laws. Now, of course, the problem here is that the interpretation of this, wearing masks sometimes fell on the law enforcement officers and not necessarily the health, let's say, professionals. So, for example, determining who is a first contact, who is a secondary contact. So, initially, especially during the very first wave in March, April, because there needed to be a very sort of like very radical search among the contacts, So the experience that the military had was very useful. The way that they generally get intelligence was very useful. But then that became a problem because it became very intrusive. So now, for example, determining the first contact. Now, if I sit in a room for 5 minutes with a patient, uh, and if I am wearing a mask and the patient is also wearing a mask, and if that patient then goes away after 5 minutes, later on, if the patient is found to be positive, there is a very, very, very low risk of transmission to me. But that we know as health professionals, we would know that, and we can determine that. But to the military and the law enforcement officers, that distinction could not be made. So if all they did was, okay, where did you go? If you were there, then those people who were there became first contact. So that kind of, let's say, decision making process was also given to the military, and that became a bit of an issue. Recently, you all might have seen a little sort of a sad situation developing. I think it was in Maharagama, where police officers were arresting people, even in vehicles, for not wearing masks. Now, this again becomes a sort of a uh, it exceeds the necessity of that law. The law of the masks was there to prevent uh, direct transmission in terms of aerosols among people, close contacts, and so on. But now, if you are in a vehicle, say, let's say, if you are in the same family and you are inside a closed vehicle, then having or not having a mask really should not matter because you're not a public risk. But then that was not determined in that. It was basically on the police officers' judgment that was considered as an offense. So we had all these little issues that now created a difficulty in terms of balancing this maintenance of law and order versus the criminalization aspect. And something that I think a lot of us were very uncomfortable with was this fact that the testing for PCR, testing COVID, became sort of like a punishment. There were certain situations where if you leave Colombo district, then we will, do a PCR on you. So it kind of creates that image within the public that, okay, doing a PCR is actually a punishment. It's not something that is necessary for the disease or management of the condition. It's now a punishment. So these are kind of things that became negative in this aspect. So these are the two media and the military involvement or the law enforcement involvement, some of the ethical issues that arose. I will, so as I said, but this is nothing new to Sri Lanka. I mean, if you go through some of the old documents, even in the Spanish flu, you can see that there were people who were protesting against this use of masks, and people who were, claiming that an attempt of the government to sort of to have a kind of a rule of power over the people, right? So these are general attitudes that always come up in situations like pandemics. Now, are we okay for time, Kirtisha? Can I just finish off here? I hope you're not. Last few slides. Do we have time?
Yes, doctor, you can.
Right. Okay. So now the last bit is about this tricky issue of the dead bodies and disposal of deaths. Now, let me just move on. For whatever reason, there has always been this fear among the human race of death. I mean, we have to accept it, and we have to understand that people are always scared of death. The other part is, especially in scenarios of infections, epidemics or infective epidemics, people also have this fear of patients who die from the illness, because there is let's say it's in a way a myth that, okay, if a person dies from the illness, then that body can then transmit the illness through various forms to the people who are living. Now scientifically speaking, this is actually a very rare situation. You see, most of these viruses and most of these bacteria that infect the person while the person is alive rarely tend to survive after the person is dead, right? So, by virtue of that, generally dead bodies will hardly ever transmit that infection. After the person is dead, the organisms, the microorganisms that come onto the dead body are what are called saprophytes. That is, they feed on dead tissue. So those organisms then very rarely now are able to infect a living person. But of course, this is not very well known, and the science is also very, I would say, has not been very clear on this. And so this issue of dead bodies that actually came, the issue of cremation has now gone a little bit beyond normal science. So unfortunately, there is other elements that have created this issue of the mandatory cremation and so on. But in terms of the management of dead bodies, the sad situation is even the WHO has been very vague, right? So they say, okay, no, it's dead bodies. There is no reported case of dead bodies transmitting the infection, but you have to reduce your funeral rites. You can't touch the dead body. You can't. You have to be sort of away from it. So it's kind of a now which is which. Now even the people who are listening will not understand. Okay, is this? So does that mean that the dead body is not infectious, or is there still a chance of infection? So this kind of uncertainty is always provided, right? So in terms of Sri Lanka, still to date, the guidelines that were developed right at the start of the pandemic, where because of the uncertainty and because of the safety, there was a necessity to say, okay, we can't take a risk. We would have to go with cremation of bodies. But then later on, now it's almost well over 1 year, and as I said, not a single case of positive COVID-19 has come from a dead body. There's no reported case, and technically, the chances of contracting the disease from a dead body is very, very minimal. But still, Sri Lanka has continued to maintain that the cremation. But again, I think there are discussions going on. There are sort of let's say reports that have been submitted by health authorities to say that, look, if it is becoming a major issue, then the negative effects of all of this are going to be more worse than the actual potential benefit of preventing transmission. And in terms of the religious rights, the reduction or the restrictions that have been have been created. Again, this is global. Now, this image that you are seeing here is from Spain, where they brought out a rule that not more than 3 people can attend the funeral. Right. So everywhere in the world there is this restriction on funeral rites and contact with dead bodies and so on. So therefore, it's very difficult for Sri Lanka to say, okay, no, we are going to go ahead and just allow the normal rituals and normal rites to take place. So, but of course, what is needed is to understand that grief, people who have suffered loss are grieving, and we being social animals, we require within that healing process the need to depend on religious rites, the need to depend on social, let's say, people. That's why we have the funeral concept, right? So that people come and visit us and pay their last respects and so on, because that's part of that healing from the grief. So when you take that away, it becomes very sort of distressing to the individual families. And again, in our line of work, this is something that we have seen several times, where people, especially if they are found to be, if the deceased person is found to be COVID positive, then the family undergoes this huge amount of suffering, both in terms of having to now undergo quarantine and isolation and so on, and plus also in terms of the stigmatization that comes from society. And in fact, we have had several situations where even the religious institutions have sometimes basically refused to provide religious, the rights to that family, because they say, okay, look, you are now, this positive, so don't come to the temple, we'll do it later, that kind of thing. So it's very sad, unfortunately, but that is a situation that has been created, which is in a way a bit of a what we call a paranoia, which has been created on these deaths. Now, in relation to the question that I think Nuanti had asked about the statistics and rural areas. Well, I mean, again, as I said, our public health system is one of the best, and we are one of the rare countries, despite having a very low budget and very low GDP, we have a very sort of sound healthcare system and a public healthcare system, and especially the midwives, the PHIs, the MOHs. They are. I mean, it's a very well established setup. So one thing that generally happens is the amount of data that and statistics that come are generally quite good, right? So we it's very unlikely for us to miss cases that are happening even in rural areas. But of course, there are things like this now. There are delays in terms of actually getting the positive reports and so on. So, for example, from a outstation, let's say somewhere like Monragal or somewhere, the blood, the swabs would have to be sent to, say, Badulla or Kandy, and then for the report to come back, it might take 2 or 3 days. So during that period, then there could be people who may have contracted the disease, who are now sort of, because they are not established as COVID positive, they are free to move about. So that kind of issue can happen, but otherwise generally the statistics are fairly okay. The other situation that we see is the actual attribution of COVID to the death. Now, most of the cases where we have encountered are people who had multiple other illnesses and then who died suddenly, but who also became COVID positive, right? So, where this COVID positivity is not really a part of the death, having COVID didn't actually cause the death, but it just happened to be there in that person, right? So, but the way the media again comes into place here, the way it is reported, sometimes it's, even though we have not given it as a COVID death, because the COVID PCR is positive, they attribute it to COVID, and they count it as a COVID death, which again gives a wrong number and a wrong impression that, okay, there are so many deaths happening from COVID. So if you look at, I think, I can't remember exactly how many we are now, but a lot of the deaths that we have are deaths which happen because of multiple other diseases where COVID was found to be positive on routine screening. So it doesn't mean that this particular person had COVID pneumonia and then died, right? So that distinction has not been clearly made in Sri Lanka, which is unfortunate, because now countries like Singapore clearly make that distinction, and so their death rates are one of the lowest. If you look at the country tally of deaths in COVID, you can see Singapore is right down, because they only put the deaths where COVID had caused pneumonia or clear infection, and then where people died, right? So those are some of the things that we wanted to discuss. So mainly the issue that we have to now develop some form of mechanism to review these policies, to monitor these policies, and see if they're actually working. If they're not working, then there is no point in continuing them. So one, I can say that, say for example, the policy of cremation. So whether it's actually working is very doubtful. So we would have to revisit such scenarios. Ravi, any concluding remarks?
We are going to talk about the positive and negative things that this pandemic brought us. Samira, shall we talk about negative things first?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So mainly the problem that, of course, in terms of COVID-19, uh, in terms of healthcare, there have been several issues that arose. So, how, as we discussed, the COVID-19 created disruptions in the healthcare system, healthcare delivery. That was one of the main things. And because of that, how certain other illnesses and other diseases may have been neglected. Now, dengue and leptospirosis, those kind of infections are still continuing in our country, but we don't see the PHIs, we don't see the people actually going into or attending to those matters, right? So that is one negative aspect. Then of course the social disharmony that has been created is very unfortunate, in terms of again there's been kind of a, like, let's say, that the blaming attitude that, okay, this cluster came because of you people or whatever, and then you had these terms being given to clusters, like the cluster from the Paleogora fish market, the cluster from the minimum, which is as if the disease was caused by them, which is not. It's anybody could have got the disease, it just happened to be somewhere, right? So these kind of things have created this negative, this stigma and negative impression among people. So healthcare workers at the moment are facing multiple ethical dilemmas day in and day out in terms of these issues. Now, they even if they want to work and help out people, there are lots of other issues. Like, say, they have to think about their own safety, they have to think about their family's safety, and on top of that, they have to still provide the service in a, let's say, sometimes reduced staff environment. Shortage of staff is a major issue in most of these situations. So hospitals sometimes now, one of our batchmates is a pediatrician in Teldenia, where the hospital was converted to a COVID ward, which used to be a children's ward. Now the pediatrician is there looking after adult COVID patients who are totally well, who have no problem, right? But then, and she is unable to now provide her services to the children who need it, because that hospital is no longer now used for that. So these are some of the challenges and the difficulties that are faced by healthcare workers that we have. Ravi, you want to tell about the positives?
Though it is a cliche that every dark cloud has a silver line, Samira, but this dark cloud also has several silver lines. There were few very groundbreaking type of medical innovations came in world scenario, and even in Sri Lanka, there everybody starts to sort of automate the day-to-day medical devices. And the other aspect of this work from home, and even to our line of work now, we can now give evidence, expert evidence from via remotely via platform like Skype and Zoom. So even for other categories like teaching, even normal administrative works like obtaining licenses, getting birth certificates, all that become the people. Those things can be done remotely now. And the other thing is, like, some industries because of this get some kind of a boost, like from this website, developing websites, developing remote access. All these things came in a positive note. It's sort of it's a mix. I would say a mixed bag, but my heart is telling that it has more negatives.
And especially
Okay, Samir.
I would like to say that being a bit of a nature lover, the fact that aeroplanes that used to sort of like just basically drill holes in the sky are now very much less, and
Yeah.
so we have factories that are running at much less. So you would remember that satellite image from over Beijing somewhere in January, February, where the nitrogen levels in the air had dropped completely to almost like 5 to 10% of what it used to be, and very clear skies. So these are some of the things that, of course, we have to also like.
Yeah, even Mount Siripada,
Yeah.
the mount we can was visible even to Colombo.
Hmm. So yeah, so several things which we have to, again, just like ethics, there is no right or wrong. So COVID, I mean, obviously we have to, as Ravi said, so there are several negatives more than positives, but I mean, we have to still continue our lives, we have to continue our work, we have to continue our contribution to society. So this is basically what we had in mind. I hope you all sort of got an idea about the complexities that most of the healthcare workers go through when managing this terrible pandemic. WHO has this as a definition of health, right? So I mean, it's a very nice definition when you put it on paper. So it's basically, it has to be complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. So, but when you look at a situation like COVID-19, right, you automatically realize that you can't be healthy and have all of these also. So, for example, if you are, say, COVID positive, then you are going to lose something out of it. So either your social well-being is going to be lost, or your mental well-being is going to be lost, but you may not have the disease. So you can, something is going to be forfeited somewhere down the line. So unfortunately, this is the reality. So from a doctor's point of view, when a person comes, a patient comes to you, now which are you going to choose, right? Are you going to choose the risk to get the disease, or are you going to choose that particular person's social and mental well-being? This is the kind of ethical dilemma that most doctors go through regularly. So thank you very much once again for inviting us. I think it was a novel experience for us also, in terms of actually putting this. Though we had gone through these several times, Ravi and I myself also had these discussions. Putting it into a lecture was the first time that we actually thought about all these ethical issues in COVID-19 and put it into a lecture. So I think that was a fairly good experience for me. Ravi, what about you?
Yes, Samir, it's and I also want to thank organizers for this and giving us a chance to explore on these things. As you initially told, there is no right and wrong. By doing that, we also came into several new things. So it was a very good experience, good exercise for us.
So over to you, Kirtisha. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. And as myself, I learned a lot today. And also some of the information I didn't heard of, like golden time you said, and also some details blown my mind, like that disposal of death regarding those information. And also, sir, if you kindly permit, can I ask some questions?
Yes, sure, of
Yeah, by
course.
all means. Yeah.
Yes, as the medical legal profession, you are doctors now. How do you think about some of these cases, some of these laws and religions and the issues we are facing are having some phases with the cultural and political views? What do you think about that situation, sir?
Kirtish, sorry, Ravi, you might have heard it, but I kind of lost you in the middle.
No, well, Kirutisha, now this if you read the history and the evolution of the society, this religion and the politics and the culture though those things initiated in a different era, uh, I'm not a historian. I did not formally studied sociology, but if I give my 5 cents, I'll for a considerable time they were remained there in an isolation, but later they become one thing. You can't separate these things. uh, Somewhere religions, some part ultimately become politics. So and sometimes the religions part ultimately will merge into the culture. So it's a mosaic like thing. You can't, there is no boundaries. Very hard to find boundaries. But uh, but fortunately science is a very, it has a very distinct, it's a compartment. But unfortunately people uh, try to make these even the science into politics, but I don't think that you can, you can merge these politics into science, because that is very logical, and it's empirical, so you can test and prove. Yes, Samira.
Yeah, sorry, as I said, so I kind of missed, but I think what you asked, Kritusha, is sort of how to balance these things, right? Religious, cultural, and
Yes,
social. Yeah, okay, right. So, yeah, so thanks for that question. So, I mean, I agree with what Ravi said in terms of, yeah, these things overlap and they sometimes, go into each other. Uh, though Ravi said science is generally compartmentalized, I generally feel that well, this is something that we teach students also. Medicine and healthcare is not pure science, right? It's a, so you have the scientific component, but you also have to always, especially when you are delivering healthcare, you have to be sensitive of the religious, ethical, and cultural aspects as well. And although science is compartmentalized, it is also an evolving thing, right? So, like if you take something in the 1950s, sometimes you find that they are no longer true now, right? So science is also evolving, and so we should not go away with the idea that just because say something is proven now, or let's say a drug has been put out now, that is the correct thing. Because, and this has happened several times in the past also, like drugs have been thought to be like the good for people, and they have been given, and you find that later on that those cause too many side effects, that sometimes you have people with deformed babies and so on. So if you read something like the thalidomide controversy and so on. So you see, so we have to be also sensitive to the cultural, religious, and even the political scenario at the time. Because if we just ignore all of those things and try to sort of dogmatically follow guidelines, then we are going to meet with a lot of resistance, and that resistance can invariably disrupt the whole situation.
yes, Doctor, I understand. No, we can't just look at the problem in one way. We have to look at it in whole other ways. As you say, I'm the first year law student, and I only been in 1 month in the university so far. So we are having these problems in not only the medical staffs or the patients, but it's affecting the whole society. So, as I said, sir, in a normal public way, in a normally way, they are having deaths, like it's frightening people, like they are suddenly someone is dying from heart attack, or diabetic patient is dying in a, suddenly, and people are thinking it's like because of the COVID they are dying. And even though they are tested not positive, they are thinking the government is hiding those deaths because they don't want to clear out those information to the public, so they may frightened. What do you think about that scenario, sir?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's a reasonable thing for people to be scared in any pandemic situation, right? Or even now when we had during the war. or even during the recent, the attacks that happened, like the bombings and so on. So there are always these, let's say, suspicions, whether this is, we are told the truth, whether this is being hidden, whether there is something else hidden here. So this is natural. Now, in terms of deaths, so I think Ravi will probably also talk about this. So yes, definitely there is, or there does appear to be a higher level of number of deaths, mortality happening. So as I showed you in the graphs, our department itself has experienced a very high number during the last 3 months. But there are again possible other scenarios. So these all need not be. Some of these may be also attributed to COVID. We can't say no, but there are also other multiple factors, like what I said about people not attending to emergencies. People
Yes.
who usually would go for a chest pain to a doctor now don't go because of that, and they stay at home either taking some some Panadol or some Kotamali, and then they just wait, and then they end up with a heart attack and die. So that kind of explanation also can be given here.
Yes,
Ravi?
doctor.
Yes, Amira, and this government is lying that that part is not specific. I mean, not specific to Sri Lanka. It is universal. That is conspiracy theory. If you go to the moon, and
Yes.
the it starts from the moon, uh, moon landing to the flat Earth and all the things. The in everywhere there are portion of the population says the government is hiding fact, and governments do hide some information, I admit. Yeah, so but when it comes to this COVID death, as Samira told, um, if you want to take home message from this thing, uh, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, it is very unlikely that a healthy person of say 10 minutes before will drop dead due to COVID. It's not COVID then. At
Okay.
least you have to have respiratory symptoms, cough, fever, at least for a I'm not a respiratory specialist, but at least for one day or 2 days, you to call it COVID pneumonia. No one will drop dead due to COVID. A healthy person. So that information you can with that information you can filter these stories.
Yes, doctor. And doctor, another thing, even though we are saying we are having these problems, still the death rate is rising. Right now, we are having 433 deaths in our country, and also within 2 days, we are having 13 deaths so far. So, even though we have so many rules, so many procedures, we are still lagging the part in controlling this pandemic. So, as a profession working in that department, what do you think, sir? What are the suggestions you make to control these situations right now?
Well, yet again, uh, now these deaths, if you analyze these deaths, um, it's very probably we are going beyond the scope of this thing. Now, if you analyze those deaths, see the complication, the ages that those deceased persons, and see whether the age, because the death was due to COVID, or that we have to first clarify whether the death was due to COVID, or whether that death is due to some other condition, just the patient happened to be PCR positive. And when you made that distinction, I don't think that those we have alarming statistics. But offhand, I'm not in a position to tell that. Samira?
Um, I would kind of disagree with you, Kritusha, in the sense that I feel that our country is controlling it, right? I mean, if you look at the, yes, true that there are deaths happening daily and these numbers are going up and down, but if you compare Sri Lanka with most of the other countries, the number of deaths is very, very much less, right? Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the country, let's say the policies that we have implemented or the rules and the regulations that we have implemented are working. That's not what I'm saying. For some reason, Sri Lanka is not badly affected by COVID-19,
Yes,
right?
doctor.
That
Yes,
is
you're right.
that part is kind of now obvious. So again, still there are concerns whether okay, now there is this new strain coming, will this new strain be different? So somehow right up to now, compared to most of like say definitely compared to UK, Italy, France, those countries, Spain, these virus strains have not affected our population in a terrible way. Of course, yes, we still have it now. You would have seen that particular doctor who died from COVID-19. So there are those scenarios coming up, but uh, in a way, it is under control, right?
Yes.
The spread is there. The spread is there. The transmission is there. People are being found to have the virus, but the actual the complications of the illness is not so much severe.
Okay. Thank you so much, doctors. It was really pleasure, and we all learned so much new today. And we wish to have you all in our near future too. We would like to thank each and everyone who joined the webinar today. And we wish to see you in our upcoming webinars and also getting to update with our Instagram followers and also like our Facebook page. Thank you so much. Thank you, doctors, again for giving us so much valuable information. Thank you and have a good day.
It was a
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you
Thank
very much.
you.